All right, I think we will get going. Hello, everybody. Good morning if you're in Denver. Good evening if you're in Europe. We are really happy to have you join us for the second in our Sapphire series that we're doing virtually this year, since we don't have a virtual component to the ISA conference. I want to start by thanking the ISA staff, particularly Sarah Dorr, for all their help in organizing this, and also the conference organizers, Erica Chenoweth and Swati Parashar, and their assistants, Catherine Rajpara and Fessa Tafera, who have been amazing in getting this all set up. We have been our conference theme has become more and more relevant over the course of the year. There's a lot going on in the world, and we decided to have this Sapphire series focus on how people sort of saw the challenges they're facing, and hear from people who may not otherwise speak with one another. And so we've tried to get people from different places, studying different issue areas to talk about the important issues that we face. We also have recruited some amazing chairs to begin the discussion. And today we have Kate McNamara from Georgetown University. And so I'm going to turn it over to her, and I will turn off my camera and become an audience member. Thanks for joining us. And Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you for your leadership in the ISA. It's been really exciting to see the different initiatives that you've undertaken in your time as ISA president. So this panel is really an opportunity for us to kind of come together and talk about what different folks see as the most serious sort of high-stakes struggles that we face as ISA community members. And I think that the idea is that we're not just going to talk about the sort of substance of the issue, but also our roles as scholars and teachers, and to reflect a little bit and learn from each other, particularly, as Debbie says, by opening up this conversation to a group of scholars that really speak from diverse positions, experiences, and perspectives, because that's really how I think we have the best chance of really trying to capture the world as it truly is. So the ground rules are very simple. Each speaker will have 5 minutes, strictly enforced. I may ask a follow-up question or two immediately, or I may sort of hold off until everyone speaks. Audience questions and comments will be through our Q&A function on the webinar page. I'll keep an eye on it and integrate it into our conversation as we go. And we'll have a good chunk of time, hopefully, in the second half, if everyone behaves themselves and sticks to their time, for kind of reflections, and also for the panelists to also, have some time to speak to each other as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So we start with Eyob Balcha Gebremariam, who is at the University of Bristol and who works on African political economy, particularly an expert on Ethiopia. I'm going to put in the chat for each speaker a link to more information about them so that you can see and click on it and learn more about their work. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it straight over to Eyob, who's going to speak for 5 minutes. Please.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, for this opportunity, most importantly for the organizers, for inviting me to share my views and perspectives. So I've seen the question that's attached to the invites, and a lot of things came to my mind, and I just want to emphasize on something in particular. So what are the most serious high-stakes struggles from where I am and from who I am at the moment? I'm an African based here in the UK, teaching and researching at the University of Bristol, and also having some that teaching experience here in the UK. For me, the most important challenge that we face at the moment is something related to epistemic justice or epistemic inequalities, particularly in studies related to international studies, international relations, global political economy. All these areas of studies are significantly, I would say, shaped by a particular epistemic orientation, which is Eurocentric, which won't be a problem if it were not that much hegemonic, and it becomes quite dominant to the extent that there is no any other alternative way of understanding relations, political, social, economic relations, be it at sub-regional level or at the global level. And such kinds of dominance of Eurocentric perspectives perpetuating epistemic injustice and inequalities is something quite invisible, which is usually considered very abstract, and people tend to find it difficult how to address it. So, for instance, one good example, for instance, would be like to what extent the histories or sociocultural orientations of societies, of non-Western societies, are considered relevant or play a central role in shaping discussions within our classrooms. Last term, in the autumn term, I was teaching African development course at Johns Hopkins University in Bologna, Italy, and are doing masters in international studies, and none of them are exposed to ideas that are non-Eurocentric. It can be from Asia. It's not necessarily about the geographic location, but the epistemic location. It's just simply a replication of what has been told for the last 500 years, particularly taking Europe at the center and every other part of the world as a periphery. So that kind of orientation is, for me, the most challenging one. And as a scholar, as an Ethiopian, I'm from Ethiopia, so for me, I always find it difficult and challenging to be relevant in my academic sphere, in my work environment, but also the community from which I come from. In order to be relevant, I need to communicate with my own language. I need to write and share my views and perspectives. But this would be an additional work that I need to do, but which will not be considered relevant for my professional career. My professional career is considered relevant only if it conforms to this very dominant Eurocentric knowledge production and ways of engagement. So it is quite a challenge. It's quite a struggle that I see myself in the process.
Terrific, thank you. And you have actually 1 more minute left, which is amazing. So can I follow up, Eyob, and ask you what you see as the biggest barrier to overcoming this question of epistemic justice?
Oh, there are lots of barriers. One is it's quite difficult to mobilize against this hegemonic power because everything is normalized. The hierarchies, the racialized hierarchy, the political economic hierarchies and inequalities created by primarily colonialism and imperialism extremely normalized, and people have become quite convenient with them. Even people who are suffering, who are on the receiving end of the negative aspects of imperialism. So that consciousness level challenge is, I think, the most challenging one.
Thank you. I hope this panel and these types of panels are one step in denormalizing that, right? And I'm, thinking, I always think Bourdieu's true power is the power to construct the given is always such a powerful way of kind of thinking about the point you're making. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to Audrey Comstock, who's at Arizona State. She's a fellow this year at the Carr Center for Human Rights. And she thinks very much about the conditions under which states are more likely to create and comply with human rights law. So turn it over to you, Audrey. And again, I'll put her bio in the.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak and engage on this platform. I had a couple of points I wanted to hit on, and they're based on how I see some difficulties in the field and also how I've seen them, and to think of, or to state my positionality, right? So I'm an American scholar at a US research-driven institution, and this will come up in a couple of my points because there are different privileges that certainly I experience based on who I am and where I'm working right now. As somebody who works on human rights and international humanitarian issues, one of the big struggles I think that we all face, but particularly within that area, is confronting apathy, ignorance, and open hostility and misinformation around human rights and humanitarian issues. So just doing a quick search of, percentage of Americans who know where Ukraine is, and it's in about 30%. And as a comparison point, only 45% of Americans can accurately describe what the Holocaust was. So maybe 30 some odd percentage isn't, the worst case. But as somebody who studies or, is deeply interested in human rights and humanitarian issues, it can be very disheartening if the general public, within which your university is in, right, wherever it is, doesn't really care, isn't very aware of these major human rights issues that are ongoing. And then that pairs with active hostility against human rights issues or misinformation around it. So in Arizona, we have a number of anti-transgender individual bills, anti-LGBTQ plus bills. This is going on around the country as well. When I've driven around Arizona to California, I see billboards of "Get the US out of the UN." There's this open sort of hostility against internationalization, against globalized ideas, against cosmopolitanism, against human rights ideas within the context that I work. And this is, I think, a really driving issue, not just for the area that I care about in research, but the areas that people are currently, the experiences people are currently living right now, as we can sometimes be detached, right? If we're not experiencing them hand in hand with them. How do we respond to this? I think there's always going to be apathy and ignorance, but there are a lot of steps people are taking to try to engage with the public more. Some of the things I see going on in the field are really exciting steps. I think a lot of the work that the Monkey Cage has done over the last years of trying to have this public interface of spreading our scholarly knowledge with the general public, seeing people do that more. I participated with the Bridging the Gap initiative, which I think is another great step coming out of the international relations space. But on a more individual level that's not as organized, I think of my teaching goals as orienting as sort of educating engaged citizens, right? How can we get them to, teaching intro to IR or my human rights classes? They're obviously not all going to go on to PhDs. They're not going to have this as their major fields necessarily, but trying to have students not be apathetic, right? Try to encourage it within the teaching and pedagogy of how to become aware of misinformation. So I'm trying to build that into my teaching to try to combat that in smaller steps. Of course, that's not going to eliminate these issues at all, but I think those are something that we're going to be engaging with and confronting for a long time. My second point is, so that was sort of more of a human rights field area. A second one is, I think, something that we experience as individuals here, which is for the pandemic time, we've been all in crisis mode, right? And how does this crisis mode end? What does it still mean? It's still difficult for many individuals. Again, I'm speaking from an R1 institution in the US, but certainly within that, but even more certainly outside of that context, people are still confronted with financial issues, job instability, issues, and very long difficulties getting visas to attend conferences. The ramifications of the COVID crisis are still present. So how do we think of as a field, what can we do to support individuals? I think that's something we still need to think of. One of the I guess tendential crisis parts that I have lived is caregiving during this. And something I think is great that ISA is doing is always having childcare within the conference space. And within that dimension, I think we can think of having individuals and institutions include childcare plans into grants and workshops and other supportive ways. And not just childcare, there are a number of individuals, right, who have elder care, other responsibilities. How can we support those individuals so they can still fully engage in what's expected of them, right? Going to conferences, doing field work. How can we think of ways to sort of continue to address that? The third briefly is sort of a more broad level, which is how do we think of climate change as one of the crisis points, but one of the big points of our jobs is still traveling, right? Traveling for field work, traveling for conferences. And I know there's there's some movement now to fly less, right, for conferences. Oh, Am I over time? Did I just? Okay.
Yep,
Um,
you are. I
I'm
was
sorry
just
about
writing you a note in the chat.
I
But yeah,
apologize
actually,
for
you've
that.
given us, plenty to
Okay.
sort of chew on. So we'll, and what I'm really struck by is sort of, again, another kind of perspective on the privileging of certain fields in the academy, for certain fields of knowledge, right? Eyob talking about the global South, you talking about human rights, and how we might better think about how to bring forward a much more sort of broader set of issues that really, again, do capture the world we live in today. So now we're going to turn to Debak Das, who's at the Korbel School at the University of Denver. Debak works on nuclear weapons, and particularly on the puzzle around how non-proliferation treaties, the things we try to do to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, can sometimes actually do the opposite and have perverse consequences. So would love to sort of hear some of your thoughts, Debak, on where we are and what we should be doing about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me in this panel. I think this is a very important conversation, and I'm glad that we are having it. So I've been thinking a lot about this topic in general, and there's a lot to say. But I think I'll try and focus on two things, and both are in the context of this idea of the standard operating barriers that we face as scholars. So the first thing is a story in Belgrade. So the story in Belgrade is that I spent 3 weeks in December in Belgrade, not because I had anything to do with research. It's because in my own country, I'm Indian, and I need a visa to work in the United States. The visa appointment wait time was about 800 days. So I couldn't get a visa, which means that I couldn't leave the United States where I work and I conduct my research, because I couldn't re-enter without a visa. So, of course, it meant no going home. It meant no going to archives in the UK and France, which is where I work, or in India, where I live and I work. It meant no APSA in Montreal. It meant no ISA in Montreal also. So I wrote to a bunch of embassies, and I spoke to my dean as well, who also wrote to a bunch of embassies on my behalf. And we found visa appointment wait time in Belgrade was about 2 days. And so off I went to spend 3 weeks to hang out in Belgrade. Now, this, of course, worked out well. I got my visa. I'm back. I'm teaching. Things are fine. But it was an expensive affair. And, I've been lucky enough to have a dean who was extremely supportive, not just in terms of writing emails, but also financially. But it made me wonder, well, I may have, the most I've lost is 3 weeks of hanging out in a new country, which was perfectly lovely, but there is a structural reason why I'm hanging out in a country which I have absolutely no connection or links to, whereas other junior scholars who started on the same kind of job track as me in other universities and elsewhere could just take the time off, or maybe use that time for writing. So there's an invisible cost here, right? And it's not just about getting a visa to work here. It's as somebody who went to grad school in the United States as well, taking an overnight bus I was in upstate New York at Cornell, so taking the overnight bus to New York to apply for a visa, and then taking that overnight bus back. And now in Denver, my nearest set of embassies and consulates are in LA. So how do we actually try and make some of these invisible barriers, well, more visible, but also how do you support younger scholars, especially scholars who are in more precarious conditions, to try and be able to navigate this? I think that's one of the things that I would flag as something that we need to be talking about and need to be thinking about as ISA, as an organization, about how best we can support folks in those kinds of spaces. On the epistemic level also, coming to the second point in terms of standard operating barriers, is I think that, and this has been flagged before by the previous speakers, we do have a certain amount of bias towards global North perspectives, right? So I'm talking in particular about security studies, which is the field that I work in and most think about. And, just a simple example is if I was writing a paper on, say, nuclear issues or foreign policy decision-making, if I had a US case study, I really don't need to motivate it. It's generalizable. It makes sense. I don't need 3 paragraphs that I might need for India or Pakistan or any other country to say, hey, this is something you should think about. This is something that we should be thinking about. Here are our generalizable contexts. We don't need to do that when we talk about US-based cases or Europe-based cases if it's the UK. So really what is privileged in the academy and what is rewarded in the academy is really not something that's just in the field of us operating or living in a space. It's in our work, it's in our writing, it's in our journals, and it's in our books that's coming out from top university presses. So I think those are things that we should be thinking about. And I thought I'd flag those 2 things as some of the standard operating barriers that I've experienced myself, and thought it's worth sharing with this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And, your comments are so interesting in the sense of, the fact that we are on this webinar is one step forward, right? In the sense of, one of the few silver linings of the pandemic was, I think, everyone getting used to communicating across, these very real boundaries that you talk about, which are, our ability to travel and to work in different places and so on, and to use webinars. And so, that's sort of one way forward, but, we still have a lot to do in terms of our scholarly structures to make sure that we can integrate people who, face the types of barriers that you face and make those barriers visible. And then I can't resist but say, one of the things that has been exciting to me in my world of sort of international political economy and comparative political economy is people kind of encroaching upon American politics and taking the US case and using it as one comparative case, and basically kind of, delegitimizing the notion that American politics could possibly be its own subfield, because how could you do that with just an N of 1, right? So that's actually been, I think, a very positive step forward. Okay, let's move on to Bianca Freeman, who's at UC San Diego, writing a fascinating dissertation on racial hierarchy and in international relations, and thinking specifically about international law and the way that it's actually structured by race, resulting in patterns of exclusion. So Bianca, I look forward to your comments.
First, thanks so much to ISA and all involved for allowing me to participate in this discussion. Also, apologies, I had some technical difficulties with my background this morning. So when I learned about the Sapphire Series at ISA and its goal to grapple with some of these foremost challenges that IR scholars face today, it really encouraged me to reflect on some of the things that I've learned about the study of race in IR. And as other panelists have stated so well, I'm particularly mindful of my experience as an American and at an R1 institution within the US, and why I believe it's so important for understanding the constitution of order in world politics. I'll note that such a challenge is also very much intertwined with the intellectual priorities of the profession, as well as its membership, and how we can better empower the voices and the contributions that are truly representative of IR. If we consider racism, specifically entrenched or structural racism, as an issue that is yet on our plates as IR scholars, then one way to think about this challenge is to first create theories that center race and explanations of how the world works. There are conceivably countless examples of race seeming to matter for outcomes such as immigration, migration, environmental issues, intervention, political economy, foreign policy, gender, all issues that I think are really well representative, again, by who is on this panel. Also, when we consider the domestic context, perhaps the United States, we observe compelling patterns of racial disparity in the data, and we develop theories that attempt to explain them. This is the case when we think about policing, housing, healthcare in the US. Politics is implicated by race, and this probably doesn't just stop at water's edge. Even within IR, we can benefit from the work of those that have long critiqued the racist underpinnings of the early discipline, and more recently, the narrow mission of race in IR scholarship in the post-war period and since. Importantly, such scholars were not just critical on the question of race, but some also produced theory with plausible and testable implications. The ways that race may or may not matter in world politics is an empirical question, just like any other explanatory variable, which, as an aside, we can conventionally think of, or what we conventionally think of as race neutral may not be in IR. So this requires serious conceptualization, theory, and research design to know. So we can respond to the events that we suspect are racialized by first thinking carefully about how this may be working, and of course, building upon and complicating those contributions that already exist. I think that to care about international politics is to care about the racial bias that its patterns may very well reflect. Two things I think are important to me in my experience is to cite IR scholars globally, especially outside of the global north and what is understood to be American IR. And then also rethinking or thinking carefully about what we mean by race in our studies. While I have primarily focused on the construct of race as hierarchy, which is everywhere and at all times contested, concepts that are always relative to whiteness are not the only way to study race in IR. So Black study, theories that center Black agency and decision-making and liberation, I believe, are also incredibly relevant to understanding how actors interact in world politics today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And, what I really appreciate is, your emphasis on first the sort of epistemic justice question of, realizing that what we think of as race neutral is not necessarily so, but then the challenge of, or grappling with the challenge and actually going forward and thinking about not just a critical perspective, but a positive perspective in the sense of building a theoretical framework, building out the empirical work to actually, allow us to better understand and sort of shed light on these things. And of course, for teaching, that sort of work is crucial, right? Being able to find works that help our students really start to understand the world as it is. So thank you very much. Okay, we will now move on to Naima Green-Riley, who's at Princeton University, working on Chinese foreign policy, particularly comparative work around US and Chinese public diplomacy. So has been no doubt a very busy person, learning a lot about balloons recently. She also is a former Foreign Service officer, so brings that perspective to her work. So Naima, please.
Thank you. I'm so glad I got to go after Bianca. She's been a real inspiration for me in doing the work and in speaking about her work. So nice order, probably just because of last names. I only have 5 minutes, and it's interesting because this is a topic that I don't talk a lot about. I think that I personally feel that I have a good amount of privilege when it comes to my scholarly positionality. I've come out of some great institutions, some Ivy Leagues. I'm an American scholar, and yet and still, I'm a woman of color in a field where there aren't many Black women doing this work. And so I'm glad that we're talking about struggles. And I just wanted to bring up a few things that I think are challenges that have actually come out of a good thing. So the field is diversifying. We're seeing more and more scholars of international studies, of international relations, who are people of color. And yet there are still some things that we as scholars need to sort of deal with in order to better our community and to better the field. So I'm going to talk about two. The first has to do with what it means to have a number of people who have different and complex identities coming into the field. And so what I mean by that is that I think that there's always sort of a moment, and maybe it's a big moment and maybe it's a small moment for some people, for scholars who are not the majority, so who are not white males coming into international relations, of thinking about how or whether they should do research that has to do with their identities. And I'll start with myself. I'm primarily a scholar of Chinese foreign policy, but increasingly I've become interested in topics of race and ethnicity in international relations. And I had a huge amount of hesitance in doing that kind of work because I thought, oh no, people are going to see me and they're going to say, of course, she studies things related to Black people because she's a Black person. Or, oh man, she's not going to be able to be objective on this point because she has this background. And I've talked to so many people who do studies that are relevant to their own identities that have the same types of concerns. So to bring it away from me, I primarily focus on China. And I recently had a conversation with a student who I think is sufficiently anonymized because it wasn't a student that's involved in any of the, or goes to any of the universities that I am affiliated with, but a student of Chinese descent who was concerned about the fact that there are increasing US-China tensions right now, and that if they do research on China at this moment in the US, how they would be perceived, how their work would be perceived, whether people would give it a fair chance. And so I do think that the issue of identity and how it relates to people's research and how it particularly tends to come up when the person is closer to the topic of research, and maybe not as much actually when people are further away from the topic of research, is something that should be discussed. And then the second thing that I think that is a challenge that I've noticed is that we're still trying to figure out what the best models of mentorship are, I think, for people who are people of color, who are young women of color in this field. And something that I personally struggled with is that though there are a number of challenges that come along with those identities, I think a lot of us just sort of like make our way through and we do the best that we can. And then when we start to see success, there are a lot of young scholars who actually need support who seek us out. And that's a challenge because number one, often I don't feel like I have great answers. And often I feel like I don't know exactly how this is, you know, how I've ended up where I've ended up or like what advice to give them. I can tell them a lot about my struggles, but that can be discouraging. And I think people, you know, also it would benefit from not only sort of my insights, but other people's insights on how to be more successful in the field. And so my second point just is that, number one, I think that often scholars who come from a particular background are struggling to find the time to be good mentors to people who might be seeking them out because they have similar identities. And number two, I sometimes think about how that group of people might be distributed amongst the great international scholars that we all are, so that others could also help them along their journey, especially those who are particularly interested in seeing this field become more diverse. I think that's 5 minutes. I will stop.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And, you know, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, the different identities at work on this panel in the sense of, you know, people, you know, from different parts of the world then coming to and, you know, as Debak was talking about, you know, having to kind of exist within this American academic setting, but as a scholar from India. And, you know, I think we tend to sort of boil these identities down and, you know, we need to kind of be much more aware of, if you like, their intersectionality, right? And so I appreciate your comments. Thank you. We're going to have our last speaker is Rahel W. Sebhatu, who's at Malmo University. She works on particularly on questions around the EU's relationship with Africa, looking closely at its development treaty negotiations, and uses post-colonial feminist theory to bring new light to the different power dynamics at work. So sort of exactly doing the kind of research that I think a lot of you are advocating for more attention to. So over to you, Rahel.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. When I was asked to participate in this panel and looking at the description, I have to be honest, I did a lot of thinking about what exactly is the ISA community. What is my role in this community of academics? In about all the conferences that I ever participated in, my network or the people that I've communicated were mostly those who were part of the panels that I were part of, especially during the pandemic when traveling to conferences was not possible. That community was quite small. And even when it comes to the authors that the scholars I like to read and engage with, they tend to be quite niche. Doing a PhD in Sweden too is, I feel, very much a privileged position to be in. Not that it was easy to get into a PhD program. If you don't know, PhD candidates are hired as staff, so we don't have to worry about funds. And then when it comes to other like social things, let it be healthcare and what have you, you know, we do have quite a cushion there, right? We do have a safety net. which I personally appreciated a lot during the pandemic, when a lot of the people that I knew were losing their jobs or their main means of income. Still, despite all this privilege that I think, the privileged position that I think I'm in, the other hats that I wear, my other identities are not as privileged. And I often contemplate of what that means for my community. I come from Eritrea. I come from the global South, the Horn of Africa, one of the most conflict-ridden regions in the world. I feel that my privilege, means that I have a lot of responsibility to give back. The communities that I'm talking about, though, is not just related to my own, my particular country, but the grander community, which I identify as mostly an African one, not just on the African continent, but also in the diaspora. So being a Black woman working, getting her PhD in Europe means a lot. And then I also feel very homesick living here in Sweden. And by home, I also do mean the continent of Africa. So in order to kind of mitigate the privilege and the homesickness that I feel, I tend to engage in a lot of other activities, which also then, influences the way that I teach in the classroom. And I also engage in a lot of informal learning. No, I'm not trying to make this about me. I swear, I'm just trying to really talk about, how I navigate these spaces. And it's because I think that, that working at a university, right? Having a professional email address, being able to engage with other scholars, I think that compared to a lot of the people that I want to reach out to, the people that I would hope to influence, my agency is not questioned as much. So what do I do when the communities that I care about, their agency is constantly questioned? My brother Eyob here, he mentioned epistemic injustice. I think it's a very serious issue. When other perspectives are invisibilized, and yet it's so visible from, where you're situated and the communities you are part of, then it feels like, at least, for me, I feel like there's a really big responsibility there. And then, so since my agency is not questioned, what do I then do? I, of course, through my research, emphasize agency, which I think is really unfortunate. Debak also mentioned something towards that regard, when you have to justify your case study, this generalization or not being able to generalize. We only have to define, or we only have to define agency when it's questioned. So through my research and teaching, I always do a lot of emphasis on that, because I believe the subalternization of people and communities is, part of the epistemic injustice that we see in the Western University. And then also, with the privilege that I have, how can I then influence others? And I say influence in a very, I'm not an influencer as such, but I would hope that my privileged position and the things that I've learned can influence others, and that includes informal learning, especially among youth on the continent of Africa through Pan-African activities. I happen to be a research director for an organization called AfroResist, and we do a lot of trainings for free as well. So I try to humble myself, remember these things by also engaging in these other activities.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And, this emphasis on agency is really important and helpful. And I think a bit of a sort of a challenge and a reminder to everyone to kind of think more deeply about the type of work that they might be able to do in their own lives. So we only have one question. And so I want to kind of throw it out to you guys. And actually, in a way, this picks up on Rahel's the subalternization of communities and people, because I think the question actually is sort of getting to that. And that is from Nazia Khan, who asks, the panel has an American perspective of IR and the challenges they face. There's a need for scholars from the Global South who could add and bring diversity in the panel, which I'm not sure how to respond to, because I think there are folks from the Global South, half of the panel really is. But, any thoughts about what might be motivating that question, or responses and reactions to that question, or sympathy to the question from anyone?
So I could just
go
some-
ahead. We'll start with Debak, and then Eyob, and then Rahel. Go ahead, Debak.
So, I mean, I read the question as, being, well, there might be folks from the Global South, but they're still based in parts of the Western Academy in Europe or the United States. And I think that's fair. I will say that, we are capturing a set of experiences from folks coming from different parts of the world in this panel. And it's a first step, and some of these challenges are important to be talked about. But that said, there is a whole other set of challenges that we possibly can't even cover in this 1 hour, right? And I think we can talk about that in other forms of programming. But I think that question is extremely well taken in that sense.
Thank you. Eyob.
Yeah, I also believe that the panel has a very good combination of perspectives from both this analytical concept division that we have of West and the rest, the global North, the global South. However, for me, the most important location that we need to emphasize is the epistemic location. Yes, race, geographic location are important and valid issues that we need to problematize and challenge. However, you may address those elements of diversity, which is quite easy to take. To bring people from the global South might be easy, but to have a different epistemic orientation is not guaranteed by having someone from the global South, so-called global South. What we need to further push forward is to have that alternative perspective that wouldn't normalize these colonially imposed, imperially imposed divisions. You may have a panel filled with Vietnamese, South African, Brazilian, all the global South speakers who will just simply replicate and say whatever that all the Eurocentric philosophers or ideas have been putting forward. So it's not only about the geographic location. For me, the epistemic diversity and the epistemic location of the speakers, so that we have like that cross-fertilization of ideas, and that breakthrough of thinking differently is somehow pursued and hopefully achieved. That's where I would firmly emphasize on.
Thank you. And, a very strong and clear statement of this notion of epistemic location as being critical. And I'm sure we could kind of discuss that for a long time. There are a lot of different, views about that, right? And that's a really important question, because it has huge implications for exactly this, the type of panels that we convene and the type of work that we consider to be important, right? And what role, our actual sort of, given identities should play versus this question of epistemic location. So I appreciate that. Rahul, please.
Yeah, I think, I hope that this question was asked before my presentation, because, I am somebody from the Global South. I think that it's something in not just international relations in terms of perspective, but also in the research process, what we consider to be scientific versus not scientific. Even those of us who come from the Global South, we can fall under this trap of, we know better, or we know that these things, some type of the methodologies that we choose will be a disservice to our subjects or the topic that we're researching, and yet it's expected. We have to go through certain steps in order to, write a dissertation or to, get a paper submitted to an academic journal, which most of the time is not even accessible to the subjects that we study. But Bianca brought up a good point that I had to also really remind myself of, and that is to read and to cite scholars from the Global South, to look at these different perspectives and to engage in it. I think it is difficult from somebody who's not from that epistemic location to fully understand the implications of colonialism, for instance, or what does it mean to, be a woman in a conflict area or what have you. A lot of times, and this is unfortunate, diversity is seen as looking for, somebody that has so many different identities, looking for the most oppressed person you can think of. Yeah. So it's definitely a Black person, probably an African, somebody who is a woman or, non-binary, who is in a conflict zone and was a child. So you just keep on looking for these, things that we think of as, being the most oppressed, and then, studying from there. But that's not what an intersectional perspective is. That's not what a Global South perspective is. And it's paramount for us, if we want to be honest with our research, to engage with other perspectives seriously. And to do so seriously would definitely be to read and to cite their work.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. And then we have another question from Naz Barma. But before I jump on that, I'm going to sort of say a couple things, which is, I think, this question about not having folks from the Global South, and Eyob was pointing out, true, people not in Global South institutions, bumps up against this problem we have as professionals who are trying to move forward in our careers, that, the money and the status is still very much, in the global North and in a very small set of institutions. And, because what we do is so fundamentally a social enterprise, right? Where it's not, how many widgets you can make, right? Everything is based on sort of valuations and judgments that are shot through with status hierarchies of all different kinds. And so those social logics have really big material impacts, right? And that's something that, I think we all struggle with in our own careers and as we go forward. I would say, as sort of the very senior, very old person on this panel, I would say, I think the most important thing for people of my generations to do, and this might speak to Naima's point about mentoring, is to think really carefully about our gatekeeper roles, right? And think really carefully about, when we do a peer review, I definitely look closely at who's being cited. And if it's the same group of people, I will call the person on it, and I'll make it part of my peer review, right? To say there needs to be more representation of a diversity of perspectives, be it gender, be it epistemic location, which is a phrase I will now use, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And I think, I'm dispirited sometimes in sometimes people of my, at my sort of place in the profession throwing their hands up, when I think we have huge amounts of power as gatekeepers to try to change some of these material impacts. Okay, Naz asks, thanks so much for a fabulous panel. Thank you. What could ISA section program chairs keep in mind as they build conference section programs to address the issues you've all raised? So any thoughts on that? And I think my point a little bit, touches on that gatekeeper idea, but ways to actively try to make sure that we are able to include all these different types of perspective you guys are mentioning. Any thoughts? I mean, one of the great things about these types of panels and this Sapphire series is it, creates a resource, right? Now, people can listen to you guys with your incredibly thoughtful comments and, integrate them into panels. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, don't be lazy, right? Don't just go to, your good old, same old, groups of folks that you feel very comfortable with. And again, I feel like the generation that I came up with, who were mostly white men, there's just incredible laziness about just inviting your friends, the people you know, who you know how they think, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what I would say. I don't know if Debbie's still on the call, she could maybe jump in and see about ISA section program chairs and, advice to them.
Well, I see a couple of hands up, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say, when I mentioned this in the last panel as well, when I was editor of the Journal of Global Security Studies, we had a process to encourage greater submissions of people who were not well represented in the journal, and it was called a pre-submission exchange. And what was most important about it is it was an exchange. It wasn't just, this is what you have to do scientifically to get into our great journal. It was, what might you do differently to allow different voices as well. And I know that many of the ISA journals have adopted this practice, which I think is great. But I think when we're thinking about diversifying, we actually have to think about doing things a little differently. And so it might be different things. We might not have the same panel format. We might have different kinds of formats. We might have, so I'm going to stop talking and listen to the ideas people have about what we might do differently. But I think that's the most important thing, is kind of disrupt our standard practices. Thanks.
Great. Why don't we go to Audrey then? Thanks.
Thank you. And this is just a small thought, which kind of extends or piggybacks on some of the points that just were said. But when we sort of form our own panels for submission, right? This is a point where we can be lazy as well, right? I know so-and-so because they went to grad school with me or because I published with them. And I think that's a place, and I'm pre-tenure, so I'm speaking from an assistant, tenure track assistant perspective, but not tenured yet. But this is a point even at my level, right, where we can reach out to folks from non-Western universities, folks coming from different epistemic positions, and try to make those panels also not just, here's one perspective on human rights or international law, and try to diversify there, and just shoot out those emails to folks we haven't met yet, and see increase the exchange of diversity of perspectives and voices. Just on the panel forming is one
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's likely that those will just be a lot more fun as panels, right? I mean, you're going to learn a ton more, right? Debak, would you like to tackle this?
Yes, thank you so much. And so I was actually going to sort of harp up that idea that Debbie talked about in terms of having the pre-submission kind of cafe, where you talk about what goes into an abstract, for example, right? I think there's even as somebody who's been going to ISA for years now, I was just thinking about the question, and I was like, well, I'm not entirely sure what exactly section program chairs do to begin with, right? Which is why I was thinking, how does one answer this question? And which made me think, well, if I'm not necessarily sure, and I've been going to ISA for a few years now, what does somebody who hasn't gone to ISA actually think about what goes into an abstract? So an immediate idea that I have is, maybe the ISA can put out a video or something of that sort, right? On, how do you apply for a panel? What goes into an abstract? What do section chairs actually look for when they're looking at abstracts? How do you form a panel? How do you reach out to other people to form panels? I think you can actually have guides like that, which can be broadly disseminated it would probably have to be in English, but then move on in other languages. And that's one way of trying to make ISA more accessible, or some of these different sections more accessible to people who might not even know where to start.
That's incredibly helpful. I mean, at Georgetown, we have something called a course called the Invisible Curriculum, which we offer to first-gen students, particularly first-generation students, and other folks who don't come in with these sort of layers of, social knowledge, cultural capital, social capital, whatever, over time. So that's incredibly helpful. It's like, drag ourselves out of our taken for granted assumptions and actually figure out, okay, no, these things need to be spelled out explicitly. Rahel, I think it's going to be our last comment before we finish up. So please.
Yeah, of course, being available to give advice to people on how they can, participate in the ISA conference is great. But at least the main ISA conference is in North America, where getting a visa is enough to make you not want to, attend. There's other opportunities, of course, at different conferences. There's mailing groups and this, so you can develop, you can be part of very nice networks. I just wanted to touch in on something that Deborah had said, especially in regard to journals. So without saying the name of the journal, I used to be an editorial assistant of one. And I noticed that, when it comes to a lot of journals, they want submissions that speak a lot to theory. You want new theories. When there is an article that tends to have more empirical evidence or empirical data, they're analyzing a particular case, their chances of being rejected were quite high. And being on the back end, I thought it was very sad because, I've seen articles, the exact type of articles that I needed to read as a person from the Global South being rejected because it wasn't considered theoretical enough. And so the problem that we have with international relations traditional, right, what we call the American perspective of IR, is that, some people are considered theorists while others are not. And if I'm going to be completely honest, a lot of the theories that I see coming out are extremely boring, simplistic, and do nothing for the grand majority of people on this planet who do come from what we call the Global South. So I think, over the years, ISA in particular has done a lot of, they have organized a lot of great panels. Access to the conferences are, a huge challenge, especially for early career scholars, because it's very expensive to figure out the logistics, but especially if you come to the Global South. To get a visa to the United States or Canada, I will not put myself through that. I would only be able to participate through ISA conferences virtually. Either way, the point I'm trying to get at in general, it's because of these, these attitudes. Who is the legitimate scholar? This is what is the main problem for those who come from the Global South, or who just have a different perspective from the mainstream, that they're not able to access these type of spaces. Instead of being discouraged, I think it's just, it's better to find your crew, right? Find your group and engage with them. And especially if you can do that in a way that, it's like closer to the people, right? Closer to your community, helps out your community, the more the better. That's my goal anyway.
Right. Thank you. And it has been encouraging to see, new journals coming out that really are, and again, taking advantage of sort of just being online, not having to print journals anymore. There are places, I think, for new voices, and Debbie was, important with ISA's efforts in that realm. So, in my field, for sure, where you publish is becoming less important than what you're actually publishing, and the conversations are, I think, really, made so much better because of that. Okay, unfortunately, we are at time, but I have to say what a pleasure it was for me to be able to moderate this panel and to enjoy the comments of all of our colleagues. And I thank each of you for taking the time out, and wish you the very best of luck with continuing your own research agendas. So really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks everybody. It was amazing. Bye-bye. See you next
Bye.
week.
Yes, next week. Bye.